Meeting for October 13th, 2015. Ms. Wong, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss?
Here.
And Councilmember Murillo?
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, and is there, will we allow for public comment for anybody from the public that would like to speak? Limited to 2 minutes, anything not on the agenda, and seeing nobody that is not interested in something that's not on the agenda, we'll close public comment, and we'll go to the staff report. Mr. Reardon, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair Rouse, members of the Ordinance Committee. As you know, staff has been working with the Planning Commission and the Board of Realtors for a couple of years on improvements to the ZIR process. In January of 2014, a ZIR working group was formed, and it was made up of representatives of the Board of Realtors, practicing realtors, city staff, and the Planning Commission. And they reviewed the ZIR process and came up with a number of recommendations to help improve the process. One of them is improvements to our ZIR template, the actual form that the property owner gets. We did significant revisions to that form to make it more usable, understandable. It clearly indicates what kind of violations are necessary. We just begun using that template a week or two ago, so I'm happy to report that. Another improvement that the ZIR working group recommended was categorization of violations and the identification of violations. We've implemented that part of our the improvements. They also recommended an updating and complete overhaul of our procedures, and we're in the process of doing that right now. So in conjunction with the new form and the procedures and this new process that we're going to talk about today, that'll help deal with some of the discrepancy issues that we've heard. So the recommendation that we are talking about today, that was an outcome of the working group, is this new minor zoning exception process. And in February of this year, as part of all the recommendations that the ZIR working group recommended, the City Council initiated the amendment to the zoning ordinance for this new process. In February of this year, the Planning Commission reviewed a draft outline of the proposed ordinance, and they were supportive of the ordinance. They had some comments regarding the appeal process and conditions, and I'll get into that a little bit. But in regards to the list of types of projects that we're proposing to be eligible for minor exceptions, they were supportive of that. So the purpose of the minor zoning exception process is to provide a method to resolve discrepancies between ZIRs. Currently, staff doesn't have the authority to sign off on minor inconsistencies with the zoning ordinance, so the only option that a property owner has is to either remove the improvement in question or to apply for a modification. And then, although we waive the fee for a modification in this type of situation, when there's an error in the ZIR or there's a discrepancy between the ZIR, the process is still pretty time-consuming, and we've heard that from the applicants. So what we're proposing is this administrative process that would give staff the authority to sign off on these minor violations. We recognize that this process isn't going to resolve all the issues, but it is another tool that staff can use to help resolve these discrepancies. Because these are administratively reviewed and there's no public hearing or notice, it's really important to look at the types of projects that we're proposing to be eligible for the improvements to make sure they truly are minor and not going to cause some adverse unintended consequences to the neighbors, because it's not okay for the neighbors to suffer the consequences of some improvement that might not be appropriate. So we've kept the list small for the eligible improvements. So we understand that it's not going to be a solution for all the violations. The more substantial violations will continue to need a modification, but that in some instances is appropriate course of resolution. So the list of eligible improvements that are included in the ordinance, I originally came up with the list based on experience with discrepancies between ZIRs. What type of projects or what types of improvements do we see? And then I also act as the staff hearing officer, so I've reviewed a lot of modification requests, and I think about what kind of issues come up at the public hearings and what kind of improvements typically cause angst between neighbors, if you want to say that. So I used that as a guideline. And then also I reviewed the existing design review administrative approval process. The design review staff has the authority to grant minor or administrative design review approvals. So I looked at that for some guidance. And then we had a lot of discussions at the ZIR working group meeting on that list of eligible improvements. And then again, at the Planning Commission meeting in June of this year, they reviewed it. They had some comments, and I took into consideration the public comments also. So it's a lot of information went into establishing the list of proposed eligible improvements. We do have a list of findings. There's 5 required findings that all the requests need to be made. And then there's 4 additional findings, and I'll go into those a little bit in my presentation, that depending on the circumstances, those may or may not apply. So I call those additional findings as appropriate. So the lists of eligible improvements can be lumped into 3 main categories. I know it's a long list in the ordinance, but the 3 main categories are unpermitted alterations and additions to legal nonconforming buildings. And by a legal nonconforming building, I mean a building that was built properly with a permit and it conformed to zoning at that time or received some kind of relief, either a modification or a variance. So the building itself is legal. The improvement that was added to it, the unpermitted alteration and addition, that wouldn't be considered non-conforming because it was never legal. So there was some confusion at the Planning Commission meeting of how do you establish unpermitted addition as being legal non-conforming. Well, that's not what this means. It means the building itself that the improvement was added to or alteration is legal non-conforming. The second group is as-built additions or expansions of hardscape, landscape, or site improvements. So that's a lot of stuff people do in their backyard to make it usable and entertaining and stuff. It does not include barbecues or fire pits or chimneys as administrative level, because those are a nuisance issue with the neighbors, with the smoke and all that. So those, if they want to keep those would continue to need to go through a modification process, because I believe that is something that's important to let the neighbors know that that's proposed. And then the last category, main category, is as-built detached accessory buildings, and that has to do with the size and also the location of an accessory building. So in regards to the findings, the first finding is a material discrepancy or error in the ZIR which directly involves the zoning standard from which relief is sought. At the Planning Commission, there was questions raised of what do you mean by a material discrepancy? And what's meant by a material discrepancy is not just a typographical error, it's an actual error. Either the previous ZIR was silent on an improvement and didn't note it was there, and you can review through records that it was there, or it was there and it was the legality of it was mischaracterized. So it didn't properly document that improvement, and now the current ZIR has called it out as a violation. So that's a material discrepancy. If there's a previous ZIR that says it's a 3-bedroom home, 3-bath home, and it had an as-built addition in the setback, and that was done in 2000. And then the current ZIR says it's a 2-bedroom, 2-bath home. So the difference is that it's the number of bedrooms, but it still calls out that as a violation, the addition into the setback. That's not a material discrepancy regarding the improvement in question. There's a discrepancy in the ZIR, but the intent of this minor zoning exception category is to allow relief of an undocumented improvement. And the property owners say, I didn't know that addition was illegal. Well, in the instance I told you that's not material, they knew that the addition was as built and didn't have permits. The conflict was in the bedroom count. So that's what's meant by material discrepancy.
I'm sorry.
You still
go over that again, will you? So you got a 3-bedroom and then suddenly a 2-bedroom. Let's talk about how that works.
Okay. Yeah. That happens when the archive plans may call it a den with 2 bedrooms, and then the previous preparer called that den a bedroom. The concern with calling the den a bedroom in the ZIR is that it might not meet code requirements in terms of exiting. It's still there, and the fact that we say it's a bedroom or a den, property owners are going to use the inside of their house how they want. So the fact that it's now called a 2-bedroom, 3-bath, they're not going to have to remove that extra area. It's just denoted on our archive plans as something different. And that's a really easy fix if a property owner wants to change that. I've worked with Lonnie on a case, Lonnie Cassidy, who's the building inspector, building plan check supervisor, and it's more of a documentation type permit that if they can show it meets the code requirements, it's more of just clarifying in our records that it could be used as a bedroom.
In case of a bedroom, it would have to have proper exodus.
Yes,
Primarily is the problem.
That's the main concern. Yeah.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, Mr. Ross? Okay, thank you. So I'll continue. Okay. So the next required finding is the improvement has to have existed on the site in its current form prior to January 1980 or August 1st, 1975 for accessory structures. And those are two different dates on purpose because there was a major change to the provisions for the accessory structures that occurred in 75. And after that, we haven't had many we really haven't any significant changes to it. So that's why those dates are different. In regards to the 1980 date, we had quite a bit discussion of the date in the ZIR working group. We originally proposed 1974, and we agreed on that because that was the date the ZIR first became a requirement. Through further discussion at the group and through staff, we changed the date to 1980 for several reasons. One being, not only in 1975 did we change the requirements regarding accessory structures, we also did a major change to the zoning ordinance provisions. So we wanted to encompass that date. Also in the 70s, there was a transitional area rezone, which rezoned a lot of properties and causing all these nonconformities of buildings in the setbacks. And then in the late 70s, I believe it was 78 or 79, we got the plans back from the county. There was like a 4-year period where they were issuing permits for us, and they didn't always document what was permitted, included in that permit. So we feel confident that 1980 is the right date. Because after that, we haven't had really any major zoning ordinance updates. We're under the process right now, but we've had minor tweaks and stuff to the ordinance, but not a major change. At the public hearing before the Planning Commission, a member of the public suggested that the date be changed to 1995 because that was when ZIRs, I think they said it's because ZIRs became more reliable. The date reflects to the improvement, not the ZIR. So it's the date of the improvement. So the ZIR can be in any time period. The erroneous ZIR, it's the improvement. So staff's comfortable with the date of 1980. Also, 1980 was quite a long time ago. That if it's been on the site that long and we haven't had any complaints regarding it, it probably truly is minor and an appropriate thing to be approving at an administrative level.
So 1980 would be like your baseline, if I can put it that way, or starting line. Would that be the right way to say it?
In a sense, yeah. The other thing I do actually want to, that triggered a response to that in the working group, the realtors were requesting if we can do a similar type of thing for building permits. There's not a process that we can do to just grandfather in all building permits. The building staff, Lonnie Cassidy and myself, have been working really hard to really streamline these processes and really look at what type of information we need. And in many of the instances, it's more of a documentation, and then an inspector goes out and does a health and safety inspection just to make sure that it is safe. But so they will still need a building permit. So the third finding relates to the protection of historic resources, and this wording actually is the same that's in our historic resources ordinance. And basically what it says is that the alteration can't alter a character-defining element of a historic or potential historic resource, and that if a building is located in the demo review study area and more than 50 years old, the urban historian needs to look at it. And this is consistent with any development, and it's a really simple process. It sounds like it's a lot, but with these types of projects being so minor, it could be held probably at just a consult level that, you know, while I'm looking at the minor zoning exceptions, I can ask our urban historian, is this okay? And it's a decision right away. So this is intended to help protect the historic resources.
Could you give an example of this?
Well, we had an example of a porch enclosure. The house was on the potential historic resource list, and they enclosed a porch as a closet, and it was a small addition, but by removing that, by enclosing the porch, it did alter a character defining element. So in that instance, it had to be removed and restored as a porch. So it's just some kind of element that contributes to the historic fabric or the historic character of the building.
Okay, because enclosed porches were not done when the house was, the original character of the house? Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, and in this instance, it was there for many years. So I don't know if it would have met the 1980, but let's assume it did. It met the 1980, and it was a result. One ZIR years ago called it out, and then the next several didn't, and then this one did. So there was discrepancies, so it met that finding. Then the next step is that we'd have to review it with our urban historian to make sure that we're not inadvertently hurting our historic resources. The fourth finding relates to all the downzoning that we did. If an as-built addition is a uniform extension of the legal non-conforming portion of the building and is generally no closer to the property line than the legal non-conforming portion of the building. And again, the legal non-conforming portion of the building, meaning it was there, it was permitted, it complied with everything it needed to comply with, but the addition was never received a permit. And so it's a uniform addition is extending, let's say there's a 5-foot setback, it's just extending that line back. And so that we're proposing, that's a finding there. The reason why we put generally no closer to the property line, because there's instances when a building's not parallel to the line. So we want to catch those situations when a house might be offset or the property line's not straight. So it's generally, we wanted to make sure that we didn't exclude any properties that could benefit from this.
So to make an example, if a house was built a certain way and then there was an addition that just took up the same line of the side of the house, but maybe extended it for another 10 or 15 feet, that's what you're calling that would be in this fourth finding?
Yeah, or there's an instance that I'm thinking of that the house had a chunk taken out and they just squared it off. And it was a small thing, and so that's something that we want to be able to have qualify for a minor exception.
If I can ask the indulgence of the committee, I think we should let Ms. Reardon finish the entire presentation because it's pretty long, pretty pithy. So
Okay.
Let's do that 4 questions if we would, please.
All right, so then the last required finding is that the improvement is located in general compliance with the Single Family Design Board Good Neighbor Guidelines. And their Good Neighbor Guidelines relates to privacy, landscaping, lighting, and noise. And so when you think about the list of eligible improvements, the 2 main ones would be privacy and landscaping. So in many instances, there's existing fences between properties or landscaping, but that's what this finding relates to. Now, in terms of the additional findings, if the proposed improvement is located in the required open yard or minimum distance between buildings, the finding is that the site will maintain adequate yard areas to provide light and air, separation of buildings, and privacy and enjoyment and occupancies. The concern here is the smaller lots. We don't want to have improvements take up the majority of the open yard area, and then there's no area on this, or very little area on the site to use outside. So that's what this means. And again, we can use the Single Family Design Guidelines for guidance. In regards to garage conversions, this relates to conversion of a garage to another use. Not in the instance, we do allow garage conversions to carports or carports to garages. This finding wouldn't apply in that case. This finding applies when you're converting a garage to some other use, a workshop or a storage. And the finding is the number and configuration of parking spaces required at the time of the conversion is provided on site. So what we would determine in consultation with the property owner is about the time when the conversion occurred and see what the zoning requirements were at that time. So, in the 50s, it might have been 1 uncovered parking space. So if they have the 1 uncovered parking space on site, I understand it doesn't meet today's code, but if they would have come in for approval at that time, that's what they would have had it provided. And so that's the finding. In regards to improvements that may increase the height of the building, The finding is that the final height of the outdoor building complies with the maximum building height and building story limitations for the applicable zone. And the building height in a residential zone is 30 feet, and in multiple family it's 45 feet. So it's not, that part's not going to come into play. What this is more for is for solar access. We don't want to grant a minor exception for a project that's going to impact the neighbor's solar access. So that's what this finding relates to. And then the last additional finding is if the improvement is within the front setback, we want to make sure that it doesn't impact site visibility, exiting driveways and corners. So this is a similar requirement for the minor exceptions to the fence height and hedge ordinance, that the transportation engineer reviews it to make sure that it's not obstructing visibility. So another provision of the ordinance is conditions, and we've proposed that conditions can be placed on the property, but they're proportionate to the potential impacts on the neighboring properties. And this, we believe, is necessary because it does open up the number of projects that can qualify for exception. That if we can if there is some concern regarding privacy, it will mainly be in the areas of privacy and landscaping. If someone's proposing an as-built windows within the setback, that's an eligible improvement, but there's no screening between and it's overlooking the neighbor, we might want to have them put additional landscaping there to help screen and provide privacy. When we review these minor zoning exceptions, it's going to be different than the fence height exceptions. The process there is that they submit an application, it's reviewed by staff, they don't put conditions on it, but they approve or deny it. This is going to be more like design review, where the applicant comes to the counter, we talk with them, and we go over it together. So the majority of the time, well, I think all the time, an applicant or a property owner is not going to be surprised that a condition's thrown at them. We'll discuss with them what the concern are and come up with some kind of solution. So in regards to the conditions, I envision them to be more in terms of protecting privacy. So in the ordinance, the last part of the ordinance is regarding the effective date of the decision, and there is no appeal process proposed in the ordinance. It was discussed at the Planning Commission. The public brought it up, and they discussed it. And they were supportive of not having an appeal process. However, they said if one was proposed, that it shouldn't go any higher than the community development director, because the whole idea with a minor zoning exception process is to expedite and to quickly review all these and come to action. So an appeal could become cumbersome. We weren't proposing, staff's not proposing one because it's similar to our existing administrative review for design review. There's not an appeal process for that. It's a staff decision. If you meet the criteria and you can make the findings, you can approve it. Same with the minor exceptions for the hedge and fence height ordinance. That, again, it's administrative approval and there's no appealable. In this instance, if for some reason the exception was denied, their recourse, they can still apply for a mod. It's not that you can't do it. It's just it doesn't meet the parameters that we set out to get an exception. So then we feel it's at the level, it does need public review, it does need notice, and it does need a hearing, and so they can get a modification. So staff's belief is that an appeal process on this administrative staff determination with the parameters that are spelled out in the ordinance, it's not necessary, but that's something I know you guys will want to weigh in on. So my recommendation for you today is to consider the proposed draft ordinance and then forward the draft ordinance to the Planning Commission for their review and their formal recommendation to City Council, and direct staff to forward the proposed ordinance after the Planning Commission review to the full City Council for introduction and adoption. I do have some slides available that I can put up on the transparency for people regarding all the eligible improvements, but I thought the most important thing to cover, which had the most discussion at the Planning Commission, was the topics that I covered, but I still have the slides and can put them up to help people see. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reardon. Questions from the committee? No? Ms. Mario, Mr. Hotchkiss?
I'd kind of like to see the slides so we know better what we're talking about here.
Okay, well, now, Ms. Reardon, these are slides that are defining or further giving us more information on what you've already presented. Is that?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah.
It was in the first
Right.
PowerPoint presentation. There was probably like 10 to 15 of them, and it just took too much time, so I thought what would be more productive in terms of my presentation is just to go over the main parts and then leave the rest for questions and comments.
Yeah, and I must say that because there is a lot of information here, and I was thinking as Mr. Hotchkiss was asking his questions earlier, that as these are presented to the full council, that there may be real world example. For example, when you did this,
For sure.
and when you as you walked us through those things, it made it a little less abstract for some of us that don't really do this for a living, even though Mr. Hotchkiss does. So with that, are you still interested in seeing the rest of the slides, Mr. Hotchkiss? Is that?
Well, let's see if it doesn't take too much time here.
Oh, it will take at least another 10 minutes.
I think we can handle that if that's all right with
Ms.
you.
Mario,
too.
are you fine with that? Yeah. Okay, very good. Please proceed.
Yeah, okay, so as you remember in my main presentation, I said that there's the three main categories, the unpermitted alterations and additions to legal non-conforming buildings. In regards to garage and carports, I said this too. What we're proposing is to allow garages to convert to carports or carports to convert to garages. That's whether if it's an existing one-car carport goes to one-car garage, or there's no size limitation, or the conversion of a garage to another use. And those could be, in terms of the conversion of the garage carport, is if they're located in the setbacks, open yards, or distance between buildings. In regards to the garage conversion to another use, it's located in setbacks. In regards to exterior changes, we're proposing to allow first-story window changes in the interior setbacks or rear setbacks. We did not want to allow second-story windows on the interior or rear because, again, that's a privacy issue, and that may be deemed to be a privacy impact. I do want to note, and I think a couple of you are on the ENZO committee for we are looking to expand the types of uses that are eligible for these minor exception processes, and it won't have to be as a result of a discrepancy. So that might be something that you discuss later on. But right now, it's only first-story window changes and then exterior alterations in the front setback, more minor facade type things. Ground floor additions, the example I gave when they're squaring the corners tucked in and now they're moving it to be tucked out. Ground floor additions that are located in an interior or rear setback, that the total addition does not exceed 250 square feet, and that is the total addition, not just the area in the setback. So some people are like, oh, you're allowing 250 square feet in the setback? No, that's not true. It's the total sum of the addition. And then that it doesn't result in a new residential unit or increase in density. In regards to roof height, it doesn't, as long as it doesn't increase the height by more than 1 foot. And again, as I said in the findings, it needs to meet solar access because we don't want to have impacts to neighbors. A cantilever architectural feature. Cantilever architectural feature are features that are not supported from the ground. They're supported from the building. So bay windows, balconies, that type of stuff. And we're proposing for them to be eligible for an exception. If located in any setback, they have to be at least 3 feet above the finished grade or floor area and does not provide additional floor area. That's interesting. The last two, there's changes to my slide. The last two is in regards to chimneys, which is right here. So when the slide got cut into two, sorry, the last two items did not get cut off. So in regards to chimneys, they can be located in any setback. They may encroach an additional 2 feet, but they must be at least 3 feet from the property line. And I want to make it clear, chimneys are different than freestanding fireplaces or fire pits. So this is something that's attached to the house. Uncovered balcony in the front setback. as long as it doesn't provide additional floor area, which by definition a balcony doesn't. However, some people say this is a balcony, it's not floor area. So we want to make clear that it doesn't provide additional floor area. It doesn't exceed more than 2 feet into the setback, and it needs to be at least 3 feet from the front property line. Porches in the front setback, those are a nice amenity to have on a house. We wanted to be able to allow them administratively. So they can be covered or uncovered, and they don't extend above the ground floor level, which means that it's an access into the house. It's a way to get into the house. And as long as it's not 6 feet, more than 6 feet by 4 feet deep, and it's not located closer to the front property line than 3 feet. Entrance landings are similar to porches. However, these are for the interior setback. They're usually smaller, and it provides a way to get into your house from your backyard. Again, unenclosed, uncovered. Is to get into the house, so not above the ground floor level. They can encroach an additional 3 feet. However, they have to be located no closer than 2 feet from the interior property line. It's an interior addition exceeding the maximum floor area ratio. And the caveat with this is it has to be contained within existing volume of a legally permitted building. So it's either a loft or a cellar. In this picture here, it shows, this is an attic space. So it's all contained within the volume. They've just converted it to habitable space or conditioned space. And so that, and it may be an old house that exceeds our FAR limits. We're proposing that to be able to get a minor exception. It's going to have no changes to the neighbor or to the neighborhood.
So essentially, it's an attic conversion in this case, right?
Yeah, or a cellar, yeah. Okay, and then the next main category was hardscape, landscape, site improvements, and those are within setbacks, open yard areas, or minimum distance between buildings. And this, I think, will help a lot because these decks that show up, but we limited them to not more than 200 square feet, and that's consistent with the design review administrative approvals. And again, not extending above the finished floor of the ground level, so it has to be at the entrance level, not second floor, but it can be, extending your living area out to your backyard. Water features like fountains and stuff, and trash enclosures. Within the setbacks, open yard areas, or minimum distance between buildings, decorative features or mailboxes or flagpoles and sculptures. Again, the cumulative total not to exceed 50 square feet or cover more than 20% of the open yard area, which I don't know that will ever occur. That's a current standard in terms of encroachments into open yard areas, and it's not applicable to barbecues, exterior fireplaces, or raised fire pits. And then the third category is as-built detached accessory buildings. We see quite a few of these too, that if they're located within the interior or rear setback, they can get an exception if they're not more than 120 square feet, they're not a separate dwelling unit, they're not within the front yard, open yard, or outdoor living space, and that they were constructed prior to 1979.
Can there be power to these?
Yeah, I'm not differentiating between power. That power would need a building permit, but in terms of zoning, whether it has a light switch for light or not, I'm not differentiating between that. Oh, well, my slide has a typo. It's 75. But my lawyer just pointed that out. Okay, and then the second part of the as-built detached accessory buildings can get a minor exception if it exceeds our current size limit, which is 500 square feet. If it doesn't exceed it by more than 100 square feet, and it's not located within the open yard, and it doesn't exceed the height limits, which in this instance, we're not going to see an over 30-foot high building. It's going to be more in terms of solar concerns. And it was, here's 79 again, I'm sorry. And it was constructed prior to August 1st, 1975. So those are the quick synopsis of the eligible improvements.
Well, I can see that a lot of these issues are indeed going to be planning commission issues, and hopefully by the time we bring this to full council, we maybe can distill this down a little bit. There's a lot of information, a lot of things that are probably going to go right by many of the folks here, but I do want to give the chance for our speakers to weigh in. Unless any questions from the committee? Nothing? Okay. All righty, for our speaker to weigh in. So, Ms. Stapleton, would you come up? We have 2 minutes at the podium, please.
Good afternoon, Chair Rouse and Council Members Hotchkiss and Murillo. As you know, ZIRs are an issue we have been struggling with for years, and the ZIR working group developed solutions to some of the problems, but unfortunately the overarching problems of reliability and accountability have still not been resolved, with which the grand jury agrees. With that being said, we are here to discuss the minor zoning exception process. We appreciate staff working on creating an ordinance that will help minimize minor zoning issues. Hopefully, this will help alleviate some ZIR issues during the transaction, but we won't know for sure until this process is practiced in the field. We have several questions which, once answered, will hopefully clarify the ordinance. There should not be 2 years since this is very confusing. We feel that 1980 should be used for both. Rather than having all of these different years. If a building permit is required, will the fee be waived? MZEs going to the community development director is fine, but for any more major issues, we feel it should go all the way to the city council for appeal if there is some kind of major issue. We agree with staff that no fees should be charged for an appeal process. And according to the ordinance, in order to qualify for an MZE, the discrepancy or error in the ZIR must involve a failure of city staff to properly identify a zoning violation. Who determines the failure? We know of many instances in which the homeowner insists the ZIR is inaccurate, while the city staff insists the ZIR is accurate. Who is correct? What's the likelihood of an exception being granted for a garage or carport that is smaller than 20 by 20? Most of the city of Santa Barbara has original garages. They are smaller than 20 by 20. Are these being called out in the ZIRs? Are there an exception for cantilevered architectural features and chimneys that are located closer than 3 feet from the property line? What about uncovered balconies in the front setback and addition of encroaching landing or front porch? As I said earlier, we're hopeful that this will help with the minor ZIR issues, but as we know, the best laid plans are not always followed. For example, the timeliness of the completed ZIRs improved for a while, but now we are seeing a lag in even getting the inspection done, therefore slowing down the receipt of the report. Just recently, an agent was told it would take 3 weeks before anyone could come out to inspect. But, it could be done sooner if the seller paid double fees. The seller had just been offered a job somewhere else and had to make sure the sale could close on time, so they paid $930. This is unacceptable. What will happen as the market picks up? I get a sense that there really is still very little understanding about the close of escrow timelines.
Ms. Stapleton, we need you to wrap up, please.
Thank you again to the staff for working on this ordinance. We anticipate that our questions will help shape an even better one. We still hold the belief that while this ordinance will help with the minor ZIR issues, the city should make ZIRs voluntary. As always, we look forward to working with you on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I can see some of the issues that you brought up are things that we can perhaps ask about, and there are also issues that are appropriate, I think, for the Planning Commission part of the hearing as well. I don't know how far into the mechanism of the appeal process that we've defined in terms of the administrative appeal and what either the consequences or the end or the cost of the appeal might be, or the logic behind or against whether we use just 1980 as the baseline for all circumstances. So any comments or questions from committee at this point in time? Ms. Murillo.
Thank you. I'm glad that we went through the extra slides. It was illustrative of all the work that's been done and the issues that have been vetted and reviewed. And I'm ready to move the recommendation. Yeah. And thank you to the speakers for their input, as always.
Yeah, I'll second that, but I want to ask more questions. Some of the comments that Ms. Stapleton made seem worthy of examination. Not the council has already said they don't want to make these voluntary or optional, whatever the right choice is. Were those comments? Had you heard those before? Her suggestions?
No, I haven't heard all of them before, but in regards to the date, I don't have a problem with making them both 1980. Well, maybe Steve's clicking on, but that would be consistent.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
That 1980, there wasn't really any major changes, so I would be open to that. In regards to her question regarding who grants the exception, that is something that the Transportation Division does quite regularly, and they do grant exceptions. It can go down to, for existing garages, 18 feet by 18 feet. But if an existing legal garage was built substandard, we're not going to call that out in a ZIR that it's a violation, that your garage is only 16, your two-car garage is 16 by 16. That's not going to be called out. What is meant by the provision for the exception is when you're converting it from a garage to a carport or carport to a garage, that's when we may need to look at a waiver, which is, again, a staff level that they grant.
She was firing pretty fast there. I don't think you have to answer all those
Give your list.
or address all those
Yeah,
now,
she
but
could
just
give me a copy
get
of
it
the
from,
letter. Yeah,
if
and
you could get it and then take a look at it, and then we'll pass that on. This is definitely just the first bite at the apple.
Right. Mr. Vincent, do you have a
Yes.
clarification?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, regarding the two different dates, I understand there are lots of elements in this proposed ordinance that can be confusing. I get that, because that's a function of the fact that we are trying to put constraints around what are truly minor zoning exceptions, since we're not going through a notice process or a hearing process. Therefore, we can't have improvements, or we cannot be approving improvements that have a material effect on the neighbors. With respect to the two dates, I don't think there's that much opportunity for confusion in this case, because the 1975 date only applies to as-built detached accessory structures or oversized accessory structures. In other words, structures that are independent of the main building. Almost all the other provisions are dealing with changes to the building itself, alterations that in legal non-conforming structures that were unpermitted. So I believe that there's a clear distinction when the 1980 date applies versus when the 1975 date applies. I understand that at first blush, they're two different dates, and it could be a source of confusion, but I think there are other places that are going to be more challenging in the application of this ordinance than that particular issue.
Okay. Well, I do very much appreciate staff's movement towards customer service and user friendliness in this effort. I think that's a very sincere effort towards that part, and trying to finally get to that accountability and reliability standard that we're all looking for. So I believe we're making a big step in the right direction, and I appreciate the effort.
I'm convinced by Mr. Vincent's arguments. I'm comfortable with the two different dates.
Okay. All right. Well, we have a motion on the floor to call the question. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And carries. Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned. So excuse me. The motion was the recommendation. Okay, so we're moving it forward to Planning Commission. Is that correct, Ms. Reardon? City Council first, then Planning Commission? No. Yeah, then say, yeah. Okay, good.